and welcome. Thank you for joining me in this conversation today. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. Everything in our social world is created through our communication. And I've said this before, and we know this because it's the very central claim of this podcast and the CMM theory which it's based on. But I want us to revisit that today and think about what that really means for us in our lives, because it's something that our conversation partners today really believe in. Today we're starting a 3-part conversation with Karen and Sonja Foss. They are twin sisters and also communication scholars. They've written a book, which I was able to read and was so excited to be able to talk with them about, among many other amazing things that they've done in their careers and lives. Some questions I would have you keep in mind as we go into this conversation are: what messages were you taught about gender or feminism, roles and expectations? And also I would have you consider what your definition of feminism is. Karen and Sonja present us with one that I think is incredibly detailed and helpful, and they make some really great distinctions. So maybe as you listen to that part, be thinking about how you understand feminism, what's your relationship to it, and also what's your relationship to the experiences of women. How do you understand that, whether you are a woman or not? In what ways have the experiences of women been included or excluded from the communities that you are a part of? Okay, so let's jump right in.
Hello, Karen and Sonja Foss. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Yes. Hi, Abbie.
Hi. I'm so glad that you're here, and I've been reading your book and loving it. And so I'm excited to get to talk to you more today. I want to let my listeners know who you are. You are sisters. You are communication scholars. And what else? I wonder how you would introduce yourself, knowing the conversation that we're about to have about your book and the work that you do, which does largely exist in academia. I want to have a conversation about how that exists outside of academia too. You also exist outside of academia. So what else is important to know about both of you?
To begin with, though, maybe we can add a couple of things to your introduction. We're not only sisters, but we're twins. And we grew up in Eugene, Oregon, and we were the only children in the family. So we ended up doing everything together. So we went into communication together. We write a lot of things together. I think what brought us here today, or where we ended up professionally, is one, that we were twins and worked together, but we have two kind of threads that came together, the feminism piece and the communication piece. So if you'd like, we could start by talking about those two threads and how they came together for us, and that might answer some of the questions.
Perfect. Yeah, start there. That would be great.
I think our sense of I'm going to start with feminism.
Mm-hmm.
So I think our sense of ourselves as feminists probably began when we were in high school. We became acutely aware of gender and the need for things to be different in society, although we couldn't have articulated that this was a gender issue. We were desperate to fit in, as most people are in high school, but we didn't. We were kind of intellectual and nerdy and terribly shy. And fortunately, we had each other to talk to, because otherwise we wouldn't have talked to anyone. I think we had a sense that if we could just get it right, we would be popular, or we would be okay or something. And it was usually, even though we couldn't articulate this then either, the right hemline. Well, and that's kind of funny too, because we sew, and we would sew a dress that both of us could wear. But because Sonja's a couple inches taller, we had to put the hemline halfway in between where it would work for me and her. So our hemlines were never going to be right, no matter what. But then there were some even more drastic, I think, examples imposed by the institutions themselves. For example, and I don't know if they still do this in high school, but on Valentine's Day, a boy could have flowers delivered to the homeroom of his girlfriend. And we thought, is anybody thinking about what this does to the girl's who aren't getting any flowers, like us. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the biggest insult was at graduation, all the girls had to ask a boy to walk in with them. So you walked in a boy-girl processional. And I was one of the 3 speakers giving a speech at graduation. And I was leading the processional. So I had to find some boy to walk with. And I should have walked in with Sonja, we're the ones who made it through high school together. But so later at a high school reunion, we thanked the guys that we asked to walk in with, and they said, "Oh, no, we are so happy you asked us," because they didn't know what they would do if nobody asked them either. So it was dreadful on all accounts.
Terrifying.
Yes. And we just thought all this funny gender posturing is really quite harmful, I think, and totally unnecessary. So at the same time that we really wanted to fit in, we also had some lines we wouldn't cross. Things that we thought we just can't do. For example, we didn't join the pep club when every other girl in the class did. At pep assemblies, which were required, we would go and sit and read a book. We wouldn't stand and clap when you were supposed to. First, we didn't think we should be required to attend. And we thought all this focus on these boys' football and basketball teams was kind of silly too. I think we really just thought, why can't people be able to make choices for themselves? Why aren't we being equal? Why aren't we including everybody instead of setting up these little social groups that are always leaving somebody out? And then in the external world, we were also getting more gender messages. Our father was killed in a car accident when we were seniors in high school. So we saw our mother all at once forced to do all kinds of things that she hadn't had. First, she had to get a job. She hadn't worked except in funky little jobs since she was married because our father didn't want her to. And then she had to do all these kind of masculine gender role things, like mowing the lawn and shoveling the snow off the roof. And so we learned very quickly that traditional gender roles aren't particularly useful. You either need to be able to do everything or have enough money to pay somebody to do what you don't want to do. And just as kind of an aside, we all ended up going to college together and graduated at the same time. And our mother actually went on to start a widowed services and displaced homemaker program where she dealt with helping women kind of manage these kinds of difficulties that she'd had to deal with. So,
wow.
Yeah, so that was pretty interesting. We also had a couple of jobs in college that also gave us our feminist sensibilities, both ends of the spectrum. One of our jobs was working in a cannery. And so we're standing on this conveyor belt sorting vegetables as they come down the line. And they're coming really fast and they're all yucky and, it's not a pleasant job. And the women had to wear dresses and we had to wear hairnets and we stood in about 2 inches of water our entire shift. And we were sometimes hit on the head with beets because there was a crow's nest where some people were out there sorting beets and they would sometimes miss the buckets. And so we're cold, we're in water, we got beets dripping down our heads. And then at the end of the conveyor belt was a man wearing no hairnet, even though his hair was down his shoulders, jeans, boots, and every 15 minutes he would just move this box that had filled up with vegetables. And he was making 25 cents more an hour. So when we discovered that, we became radical feminists on the spot.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes. So on the other side of things, we were also counselors at a campfire camp. And this was an all-female environment. So we immediately felt at home. We felt affirmed for who we were. We didn't have to conform to the rules and expectations of this sort of larger patriarchal world. And it literally gave us a glimpse into what a woman's world could look like. As a result of that, our personalities changed a lot. We became a lot more self-confident. We knew we could be okay in the world. We knew we could find a way to make that work. So it was a very positive and affirming experience. So anyway, it was really in college that we took on the feminist label because of all of these experiences. But it was also right in the midst of the heyday of the women's movement of the 1960s. So we read Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. In fact, we went home from college one time to find our mother reading it as well. And like so many women said, it changed our lives, and it really did change our lives. But we worked to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. We went to the March for the ERA in Washington. We went to NOW conventions. We wore ERA bracelets. They were like POW bracelets. You weren't supposed to take them off until the ERA passed. Well, we could wait many seconds.
You still wearing them?
But we are not still wearing them. We should be, though. So anyway, that's kind of a bit of our feminist sort of background. And now I'll let Sonja take over with the more educational piece. So our educational beginnings were probably a bit different than you might expect. We were not communication majors as undergraduates. We majored in Romance languages, French and Spanish. We graduated from the University of Oregon in 1972. And we were going to be high school French and Spanish teachers. We'd studied French and Spanish in high school, thought we might as well continue. We liked our French and Spanish teachers. Most of them were women. They were the only women professors we tended to have. And the language lab was a safe place to go and hang out when we didn't want to go to those awful pep assemblies. But then we decided, well, when you're a language teacher, a foreign language teacher, you look at confused faces all the time. And we didn't want to look at confused faces all the time. And plus, we thought, why do we want to go back to high school? We didn't like high school. So we canceled our student teaching in French and Spanish. And we sat down in one of our dorm rooms together and we thumbed through the college catalog to see what else we could major in. And we came across the speech department. It was called speech back then, the communication was. And so we thought, well, this sounds kind of interesting. And we actually knew a couple of people majoring in that, and they seemed to like it. So we walked over to the speech department and we said, can we get a master's degree here? And they said, sure. So then we enrolled in the master's program. And this was the era when the focus of speech or communication at the time was only on studying speeches. And in particular, the studies of great white dead men.
Yes.
It was really what we now call the era of womanless communication. We never studied anything about women speakers or women's communication. And Karen, in fact, remembers raising her hand in a graduate class and asking if she could write a paper on a woman speaker instead of a man. And they did let her do that. So we were going to teach at the community college when we finished our master's degrees. But one of our professors said, well, you'll end up just teaching fundamentals and you might enjoy some other things more. So he said, why don't you go on for a PhD? And we had no idea what a PhD was. And so we said, we don't know anything about that. And he said, well, PhDs put their pants on one leg at a time like anyone else. Well, that wasn't very helpful.
No.
That was the extent of mentoring at the time.
That's funny.
So I went to Northwestern University. Karen went to the University of Iowa. And anything that was done about gender or feminism was introduced by us or other feminist students. We had no women professors. We both developed and taught courses on women while we were in our doctoral programs. I taught a course, The Rhetoric of the Women's Movement, and Karen taught a course called The Articulate Woman. And then we did our dissertations on feminist topics. Mine was an analysis of the Equal Rights Amendment debate, and Karen looked at the communication strategies of three feminist groups. So then we got our PhDs, we started teaching. I started out at Virginia Tech. Karen started out at Humboldt State University in California. Again, we continued to introduce courses on gender and women in the curriculum, courses like Women in Communication or Sex Roles in Communication. We became co-editors of a journal, Women's Studies in Communication, and we were co-editors for 7 years. We kept teaching at various places, kept publishing. I taught, for example, at Ohio State University, the University of Oregon, the University of Denver, and I retired from the University of Colorado, Denver. Karen taught a long time at Humboldt State. She was a visiting professor at the University of Massachusetts, and she retired from the University of New Mexico. So throughout our careers, we've published articles and books that deal with the intersection of feminism and communication. So we started out by publishing pieces that incorporated feminism. So generally with this focus on great women speakers or movements involving women. And that was the way that feminism intersected with the communication discipline at the time. And we also worked to incorporate the communication practices of women into theories about communication, just trying to get women's communication patterns to be seen as legitimate. And then we realized that just by adding women's communication practices into the discipline was not enough. It was inadequate because those differences would not be seen as legitimate, or they wouldn't be seen as measuring up to the standard models, because everybody had been using these models of communication that really dated back to Aristotle in the 5th century BC. And when you put a totally new kind of data like women's communication in, the data have to get squeezed and scrunched all around to make them fit into those theories. And so as a result, we said, well, we can't just try to get women into the discipline, like add women and stir. What we really need to do is to rethink the assumptions of our theories and our concepts and try to figure out, well, what would this thing look like if we seriously took into account what women's practices are like, or the practices of other marginalized groups. So then we turned our attention to what we call reconceptualizing. And this is when you take a construct or a concept in communication and try to figure out, well, what would this look like if we formulated it from how women talk instead of how men talk, for example. So we've co-authored 3 books that really reconceptualized communication models in various ways. One is Inviting Transformation, Presentational Speaking for a Changing World. And here we reconceptualized the traditional model of public speaking, which again comes to us from Aristotle, 5th century BC Greece. So what we tried to do in this model was create a whole different way of looking at and doing public speaking that incorporated the way women talk and the way African Americans tend to talk and the different values that they have in their speaking practices. Another book we did was called Women Speak, The Eloquence of Women's Lives. And here we reconceptualized what's called public address. And that just means speaking in public. And what we did in this book was to show how when you conceptualize public address, how it's been conceptualized, women get left out, or all the many ways in which women communicate get left out. So in this book, we've got various texts of women's eloquence that would not meet the standard definitions of public address. So things like writing holiday letters, or sewing, or the talk between mothers and their children, or shopping. I mean, these are all communicative acts that certainly both men and women do, but especially back then, they were largely done by women, and they didn't count as important communication because they didn't meet that standard definition of public address. And we also did a book called Feminist Rhetorical Theories. And here we laid out the communication theories of 9 different feminist theorists, including people like Bell Hooks, Gloria Anzaldúa, Mary Daly, Sally Gerhardt. And we explained at the end of each chapter how that theory reconceptualized various communication concepts. And then our latest book, Feminism in Practice, Communication Strategies for Making Change, focuses on the change strategies of 20 contemporary feminists from all different arenas. And many of those strategies look pretty different from the traditional persuasive strategies that we tend to see. So that gives you a sense of how we got where we are with both feminism and communication kind of intertwined. And that's sort of an overview of what we've been doing in our careers.
That was great. I feel like I have a much better understanding of how you're showing up to this conversation and how you intersect with the work that you do from the background that you've come from. This is such a little side note out of everything you just shared to go back to. But I'm just curious, when you started teaching, were you like the only professors who were women at the time still, or at that time were you starting to see more professors who are women in the communication field?
Yeah, when I started, there were probably a quarter of the faculty was women. But I did have an interesting experience. I was on a contract. It wasn't a tenure track line. And they said, well, if you do well, we'll renew your contract. And so at the end of the first year, the faculty took a vote and decided not to rehire me. And they said I could stay one more year and then I'd have to leave. And the reason they gave was she's too interested in women's studies.
What? That's horrible.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting they would actually admit that. They would never admit that. They would find some other reason that was much more. Exactly. And luckily I got a job then, so I didn't even start that second year. So
Then they're saying that as an insult to you. And I would have been like, yes, I am. Thank you for noticing.
Yes.
And it's important that I am.
Yeah.
And I'm realizing, you talking about your experience of studying communication at whatever levels is that I owe so much to you and so many of your colleagues for the way that I got to study communication, because I wasn't, of course, there's still such a skew of like women aren't, taking up as much space as I think they should in our field in terms of the content we're studying or the people we're studying. But I never had to experience to the extent that you were experiencing of saying, I'm not represented in this. Right. What I know to be true about communication isn't represented at all here. And I kind of want to jump right into part of your book that I've really been thinking about since I read it. And that's, I believe it was in the chapter about Lizzo, talking about body normativity as opposed to like a body positivity. And I've just been thinking about that normativity sounds like not as exciting of a word or a thing to be doing, but I think it's so important when you go back to your definition of like a radical feminism, saying we got to overhaul this whole system because men have been deemed as the default or what is normal. What we need most for the experiences of women is to normalize, even though it maybe doesn't sound as glamorous as doing anything else with the experiences of women. But I just think that's so central to it. And maybe we overlook that because we want to go for something more glamorous sounding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I feel like that's what you have been doing in all of your work, is this like normalizing of just making it a part of the conversation because it is and it should be.
Yes. Yeah, it's an interesting way to put it. I don't think I would have ever thought about calling it normalizing, but yes, absolutely.
Yeah, just saying, this is normal too. It's not other, different, wrong.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
My love, and it seems like your love as well, is language, and communication is, so many things, but a part of that is the language that we choose to use. And so I wonder, what kind of language can you give to what you wrote about in your most recent book that helps the topics that you wrote about to be more accessible to people? How would you describe what you wrote?
We've always been really concerned about how can we say this so regular people can kind of understand it.
Yeah.
I think our books are written as if they could cross over, not that they do, but writing so that communication concepts that seem basic to us but are probably quite foreign to some people,
right,
at least be understood and thought about. Yeah, and I really like Bell Hooks' approach to this. She was always really concerned with accessibility too. And she wrote her first book deliberately without footnotes, because she said people going to work on the bus don't read books with footnotes. And so she deliberately left them out so that regular people would feel okay picking up this book and reading it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you do a great job of that in your book. I think, you get at that theory, but it used so much language that got me so excited about it, and language that I knew that it was showing up in my everyday life, and I could see the parallels there. And that I think it was so powerful that you were able to use 20 different women who are in the public sphere to be accessible. And, when I flip to the next chapter, I'm like, oh, I already have some ideas about who this person is or what I know of them. And then you adding that layer of analysis about what their feminism looked like.
Yeah, it was very fun to pick these 20 women and just how different they are and how must they each contribute in very different ways to, what we call feminism.
Yeah.
That makes you be accessible too, because you're working with regular women out there still doing their craft or whatever. And so you have to take into account their language as well.
Mm-hmm. On my podcast, I'm always kind of talking about communication as a lens that we're using, because that's how I use it. I see everything in my life through. It's like I'm wearing the glasses that have the communication lenses. And I feel like you've added, I don't know the best metaphor, maybe my metaphor kind of falls apart here, but it's like a bifocal, or I don't know, another pair of glasses you're putting on, of having the lens of communication and then the lens of feminism. And I feel like that's so enriching to look through both. But I'm curious about, for you, what has your experience been of using both of those lenses and learning and seeing in your own lives and work how they interact with each other?
Yes.
Yes, we have a lot to say here.
Perfect.
Again, as you said, there are kind of two lenses here. So I think we'll start with the communication one, and then we'll do the feminism one, and then we'll try to put them together somehow. But I think our starting point in terms of communication that's really going to ultimately intersect with feminism is the kind of truism in the communication discipline that communication creates reality. Now, this has been floating around for decades, but we take this very seriously. I'm not sure everyone does. We believe that the essential nature of the material world is that it's not material. We see the world as one of energy or vibration or whatever you want to call it. And choice is the basic mechanism by which the world is manifest, by which the world comes into being. So in every moment, we face a lot of different choices. We have a lot of alternative possibilities we can choose from. So we choose, and then reality is created. And the way we choose? With our symbols, our communication. So to change reality, we have to change our symbols. We have to change our communication. This is backwards from how many people think about reality and communication. Many assume that there's reality existing out here, and then we come along with our communication and talk about it. But we see reality as the result of the process of communication. So reality isn't fixed. It changes according to the symbols that we use to communicate about it. So some examples. If you call a rambunctious child spoiled versus gifted or obnoxious, you're going to have a very different reality with that child. Or you describe your colleague as ambitious and motivated or pushy and aggressive. Again, a very different experience. We actually have a funny experience of this from our childhood, when I'm not even sure what the context was, but our father told the story of, it was summer, he was in an unair-conditioned house on the second floor trying to sleep, and it was really hot, and the window was stuck shut. So he was getting hotter and hotter and more miserable. And finally, in the middle of the night, he picks up a shoe and throws it at the window and breaks the window. And this nice, cool breeze comes floating in. He wakes up in the morning to find he'd broken the mirror. He hadn't broken the window, but his experience was as if he had broken the window.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your reality depends on what you think that reality is.
Yes.
And how you're choosing to talk about it.
Yes.
So again, the fact that communication creates reality is very important to us. And many feminist scholars in different ways also have that kind of view. So I'm going to let Sonja take it over from here.
Yeah, so I'm going to explain the feminism piece. And we first want to start by acknowledging something that I think we sometimes forget, which is that feminism has been a resounding success. It's one of the most successful social movements in recent history. Now, certainly inequalities of all kinds still exist, but there have been major strides since the second wave of the feminist movement in the 60s. Women can work in almost every occupation. You can't be fired for becoming pregnant. You've got legal recourse if you're sexually harassed. Girls can wear pants to school. Yeah, we could.
Yeah.
All of these are changes that can be attributed to feminism. And of course, feminism has made men's lives better too. Men don't have to adhere to these really strict norms of masculinity. They can be stay-at-home fathers. They don't have to be the sole breadwinners for the family. So the story of the feminist movement is really this triumphant, happy story. And I think we sometimes forget that in all the controversy that sometimes swirls around feminism. So because of misconceptions and the controversy swirling around feminism, we thought it might be good if we at least explain what our definition of feminism is as a starting place. And I think a lot of people have a definition of feminism in their heads, and it probably involves something like a belief in equal rights for women and men, or treating the sexes equally in political, economic, and social arenas. And that's not a bad place to start. But there are a couple of problems with this definition of feminism as making women equal to men. One is that it assumes that all men have more power, wealth, freedom, and status than all women. And of course, that's not true. Men who are poor, who aren't white, who don't fit dominant definitions of masculinity, don't have greater power than all women in the United States. And in addition, there are many different ways of being a woman. Some women enjoy greater opportunities than others because of class, race, occupation, physical appearance, religion, sexual orientation. So when feminism is defined as the effort to get women equal to men, that raises a question, well, to which men do women want to be equal? A second problem with feminism, when you define it as getting women to be equal with men, is that even if we could identify men to whom women should be equal, the definition suggests that the point of feminism is to get women to measure up to what men already are. And from this perspective, men remain the point of reference. Their lives are the lives that women naturally should want.
They're normal.
Yes, exactly. What we were talking about before. So this definition assumes men are the standard for what is seen as normal for human beings. So if the first problem with that equality definition is equal to which men, we could say the second problem with that standard definition is why equal to any man? Now, I think there's a third problem with this definition of feminism, and it's that some people have ambiguous genitals or internal reproductive structures that don't correspond in the usual manner to their external genitalia. How should they be classified if we're talking about women and men? And there are people whose bodies don't match up with their feelings and desires around gender. People who identify as trans or gay or queer or bisexual. And how would these people fit into a definition of feminism as making women equal to men? So because of those problems with that standard definition, we like to go in a slightly different definition of feminism. We're choosing to see feminism as a perspective or a way of looking at the world, and we see it as a way of approaching experiences that involves three processes: understanding, critique, and transformation. So let's start with understanding. What feminists want to understand is how gender operates in the world. So many people have been oppressed and discriminated against through history, but feminists focus on the problem of gender. So feminism encourages people to understand the gender system in which they live, and instead of taking it for granted, as we all usually do, scrutinizing their beliefs and assumptions about gender. And trying to understand something about gender usually begins when we encounter something, a policy, a practice that involves gender that seems odd, or we get a sense that something's wrong, or it just doesn't seem right. And so we kind of mull that experience over, and it doesn't really make sense. And we keep thinking about it, and we figure out other experiences we've had, and we see patterns across them. Our experience of working in the cannery was one example of that. Like, something seems to be wrong here. And it seems like it has to do with gender. So that's one part of this feminist perspective, trying to understand, how does this gender system work? But a feminist perspective not only helps people understand how gender is functioning in the culture, it also involves a critique of the conception of gender in the culture. And feminism usually critiques two things. One is it challenges the restrictions imposed by the gender binary in our culture. Most Western countries, including the United States, organize according to a male-female binary. So there are two realms, feminine and masculine. They're set up as opposites, and every person is supposed to fit clearly into one of those two categories. So feminism challenges those gender restrictions. It says this is useful for people, and this is not how things have to be. And feminists not only critique that gender binary, but they also challenge the subordinate women that women have been assigned in that binary. So women occupy discrimination, injustices, they've got disadvantages simply because they're women. And so feminism critiques gender as a social system that distributes power unequally. This asymmetry is given all sorts of names. The most common one is patriarchy, which is a system where men are superior to women, and they've got privileges that women don't have. So feminists are critiquing that system too. So feminists not only want to understand and critique gender relations, but they also want to transform or change them. Now, here we come to another interesting question. If feminists want to change women's position in society, what kind of change are they after? Because after all, anti-feminist groups want to change women's position in society too. So we need to clarify what it is that feminists want to change. In the future that feminists envision, all genders are liberated from the constraints of that gender binary. People are free to be themselves. They're not disciplined or punished because they don't conform to a certain image of masculinity or femininity. They're able to live their lives in ways that suit their abilities, their preferences, and that aren't dictated by the restrictions of that gender binary. And there's another aspect of this alternative vision that feminists want to see, and it involves eradicating what Bell Hooks calls the ideology of domination. And the ideology of domination is simply the idea that it seems natural for a group or an individual to dominate other people. So feminism tries to address this ideology of domination, wants to change it by essentially saying, we don't think domination and oppression are worthy human values. And we don't believe that differences need to be ranked on a continuum going from good to bad. We think there are better, more humane, more enriching ways to live. And so feminism then, from this perspective, is a commitment to eliminate relationships of oppression and domination wherever we find them, whether that's of women, African Americans, or other racial groups, old people, lesbians, gay men, trans people, people with disabilities, and our coworkers, our friends, our family members. We often do a lot of dominating over them. So we've got then this feminist perspective where you're trying to understand and critique and transform gender relations. Once you begin to do that, to think critically about gender, you're not likely to stop with gender. So feminists are likely to end up questioning other things as well. So feminism is now often equated with practices of disruption in general, practices that unsettle or question common assumptions, raise questions about traditional perspectives, and just encourage a reconsideration of what we've taken for granted. So in its broadest sense, then, we can think of feminism as a way of thinking outside of established categories and boundaries. So it really involves kind of a radical skepticism toward the status quo. And now Karen will finish the explanation of our view of feminism.
I think it's important to remember that there's not just one kind of feminism either. There are feminisms, because what works for one feminist is not going to work for the other, which I think has become clear from what Sonja has said. But just to give a few examples of the different types of feminism in case your listeners are not familiar with them.
Yeah.
Well, there's cultural feminism. Cultural feminists believe that women and men are different psychologically because of the way culture shapes individuals. So it's gender socialization that really encourages women to develop different behaviors and ways of being in the world. There's ecofeminism. Ecofeminists claim that the oppression and domination and exploitation of women and other marginalized groups is parallel to and has caused a lot of environmental damage. So there's kind of two parallel tracks that both involve oppression, domination, and exploitation. There's girly feminism. Girly feminists like the intersection of feminist politics with feminine culture. So they like traditionally feminine things, Barbie dolls, fashion magazines, wearing makeup. And they also like traditional women's crafts, knitting, baking, those kinds of things. So they don't see them as ways that the patriarchy is oppressing them. They see them as interesting forms of self-expression, or they see them as kind of campy and fun and ironic. But they also think women's skills and interests should be valued. So the knitting and the baking should be brought into the entire world, not just kind of kept apart in a women's world. There's also indigenous feminism. This is the integration of indigenous knowledge and perspectives into feminism. So what these feminists want to do is to validate indigenous women in the context of their own cultures, rather than from the perspective of mainstream white patriarchal values. And of course, there's lesbian feminism, where women are encouraged to be women identified, to put their focus not on men, but on women as a way to resist patriarchal oppression. So feminists really are a very diverse group. As I said before, it just makes sense to talk about feminisms, not feminism.
That is where we end part 1 of this conversation, but you can come back and join us next Monday for part 2, and the Monday after that for part 3. One thing I would be taking away from this conversation today is that we've already talked a lot. I've talked a lot about using this communication perspective and kind of thinking of it like a pair of glasses. It's one lens to see the world through. So based on our conversation today, I wonder how your perspective changes if you add the next lens that we talked about, feminism. And when you look at the world through the lens of communication and feminism, how does what you see change? And how does it change how you want to act and how you want to be in the world? All good things to be thinking about until the next conversation. As always, I get to do this podcast with support from the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives that we are working on putting out into the world, always with the goal of creating a better social world. So if that's your goal too, I'd encourage you to check out the links that I have in the description to all of the work that we are doing at the CMM Institute and look for some ways to be a part of it. And of course, the next turns I want to offer you today are to follow this show, leave a rating, leave a review, share it with a friend. I think these conversations are great on their own, but become even more meaningful when we take them into the other areas of our lives. And by that, I mean invite other people that are in our lives into these conversations and keep them going. And so I hope that you'll share this episode, maybe take some time to be thoughtful about that today, about who you want to invite into this conversation and what that could do for your relationships or your communities as you invite more and more people into this conversation. Also, I'd love for you to connect with me wherever you can on Instagram at Stories Live Stories Told Pod, on YouTube at Stories Live Stories Told, or at my website at storieslivedstoriestold.com. I'd love to connect with you and be just one of those other avenues of keeping that conversation going. So thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Live Stories Told.